Welcome, everybody, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation broadcast. This is going to be a fun one, and I think one that is really so important because we've been dealing with the causes that many people, especially in academia, have a difficult time appreciating pertaining to what made different moments in history possible for good or for bad. It's there's this plague of description of trying to describe things that can be plotted into a chart and then infused with imaginative creative writing to explain away, why a war happened, why a peace treaty happened, why an assassination had happened. But nobody really deals with the question of really, truly, um, really, why did they happen? What is there a universal continuity, a common set of principles that shape the tragedies and the successes throughout human civilization? And I think a lot of people here, if you're here, it's because you recognize that we are living in history, that there are certain sets of ideas that every time that they have been adopted have resulted in dark ages, in collapses of potential, in the increased stupidification of the population as a whole. And when different sets of ideas, more noble ideas, more in harmony with natural law, have been adopted, have been fought for, that the opposite has happened. Dynamics pertaining to the rise of renaissances, the increase of political freedom have occurred. And we all know that culture and education are extremely important. They're often overlooked way too much when people try to make sense or talk about or opinionate about geopolitical events, both past or present or future. But that's everything. So in, I've been conversing now for some years with my friend Alex Getachew, who has been an educator, a researcher uh, for a long time. His passion, his heart, his mind has been devoted to this question of causation. And he's been last time I had a conversation with him some months back, he was telling me about some of the work and the research that he had been doing on the brethren of the common life, which blew my mind. And it's something that I think is so vital to appreciate as the invitation that everyone received touched upon, how did the Renaissance, the golden Renaissance of Italy happen? How did the dynamic that shaped the great minds, the geniuses that led, England into nearly becoming a real country, although many were executed like Thomas More. What cultural matrix did they emerge out of? What was the thinking of what's the philosophy of education of this important centuries long movement of the brethren of common life, and how can we learn from that in shaping strategies and pertaining to our future today and our kids and grandkids and those unborn? How can these ideas be revived in some sense today? So Alex agreed to do a presentation. It's been a few months coming, and I'm really, really happy that now is the time that's finally happening. And like usual, after his main presentation is finished, we're going to open up for some dialogue, which, like usual, I ask people to put their names in the chat box, and I'll call upon you accordingly. If you do want me to read your question, make it short and concise, and I'll do that. Without further ado, Alex, the stage is all yours.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate the overall work you're doing and the motivation of it. And I believe this came up in the course of you and I discussing my interest in understanding why today's higher education system has been so problematic with the various compartmental tendencies toward empiricism and just rigid positivist and low-level kind of technocratic thinking. And so some of my research has been focused on how the paradigm of neoliberal ideology has essentially completely hijacked education. And in this context, what we think about is that we have to situate it in the context of history. How did this come to be? How is this model of this oligarchical model of society directly implanted onto how we educate? And in this context, the issue of the brothers and sisters of the common life came up, and this was an educational movement that really was, committed to this idea of getting the church away from the corrupt paradigm that in the late 1300s is when this movement began. And the concern of Gerard Groot, who was the individual who began this movement, which was primarily an educational movement, as hopefully you'll begin to see in the course of our discussion today. And in that time period, there was obviously a political motivation. Some of the underlying ideas about political ideas could not be openly discussed at this time because they were living in a certain sense in the context of the what was described by Gerard Groot and later people like Nicholas of Cusa of things in the church that needed to be changed, kind of these radical oligarchical tendencies that basically were dominated by Aristotelian empiricism and stealing and and basically the money changers had taken over the temple. And so Groot and these guys, Groot in fact began his career. He initially intended to go into the priesthood, but Gerard Groot came to the realization that he could, a lot of what he, kind of began to recognize about the virtues of Christianity had to be cultivated for him. He saw it as necessary to do it outside of the culture that he was of the church that he was about to enter into. And then he began to take on modest responsibility within the church, but he began to preach independently, admonishing church leaders to stop stealing money from people and to begin to lead by example by leading virtuous lives and so on. And at a certain point, Gerard Groot was, forced into quietude regarding his sermons. He was forbidden to preach, but he humbly accepted this. But he continued, but he didn't stop organizing. One of the things that I will do is I will try to do a screen share right now to begin to show you some of my, at least my very minimalist slides. You'll give me a moment. I presume you can see my screen. Okay, great. So what Groot recognized was that a lot of the stultifying, what he saw as mind deadening kind of formalism that was in the church and corruption, he saw that as as something that people could only be liberated from by creating a social process that wasn't suffocated by what he saw as a corrupt church culture in that time period. And so Groot began to organize his own social, educational, and spiritual salons, so to speak. And one of the key people one of the first persons he actually recruited to this process was a gentleman named Florentius, who would then go on to be a Groot's successor after Groot passed. Florentius went on to become he went on to actually take the baton from Groot. But these two worked together, and it was actually at the suggestion of Florentius that they actually take this culture where they were actually meeting at Groot's house and reading, doing spiritual exercises, reflecting on religious texts, but also they set about the work of translation and transcription of important literary works. And this is particularly important because one of the things that was a very crucial pillar of what became there were. It's important to understand that this was not occurring in a vacuum. The one of the important things to recognize is that what Groot did with creating an educational movement, which ultimately became it was quite revolutionary in many ways. What they were doing for pretty much the first time in history, in that we know of, they created a process, an educational process, which was open to people of all classes. They created an environment where people who were poor, people who were orphans, they wanted to ensure that anyone who showed promise and was seeking education could get it. And this became ultimately something that whose influence spread throughout Europe, both in terms of them setting up schools in different places, as well as their educational methods gaining currency. But it's also important to recognize that this was not happening in a vacuum. Let me just point out that one of them is that a lot of times it's assumed falsely that education in the vernacular was, kind of came about as a result of the Reformation, and this wasn't true. As this was something that was actually we know that Dante Alighieri and Petrarch and the pre-Renaissance humanism that Petrarch represented were strong advocates in translating the Bible into vernacular languages, and also fighting for the idea of access to direct original texts. They were saying we got to get education away from these rotten textbooks, and I think we find ourselves in a similar situation today, and get people to emphasize the idea of developing an intimate relationship with people who developed and cultivated revolutionary ideas. Plato, and obviously Plato and Socrates, the Greek philosophers and scientists, and of course the figures from key figures from Rome. For example, the figure of Cicero is one of these very big influences, because Cicero himself was making these arguments about the kind of approach that needs to be taken in education. And as a result of this humanist movement and the Brethren of the Common Life, a lot of this would later directly influence the kind of discussions that shape what the founding fathers of the U.S. Republic would use as the basis for constructing a republic. Right? It was the work that the Brethren did that made that possible, as we will see with the rapid dissemination of and transcription of books, from the classical era. And so it's important, again, this was not an isolated movement. And as you and I know very well, Matthew, that there's not, even when you have genius and creative processes and individuals, that's accelerated by an underlying fight and intention to socialize these processes. So as we just reflected with the fight that Dante and Petrarch had, and this was explicitly political. Dante and Petrarch were explicitly discussing why a certain approach to education was necessary for freedom, right? That this is one of the reasons why Dante argued that the vernacular was crucial in order to have citizens who could participate in the language of discourse and consent, and not only as consent as the governed, but to participate in the governing process. And so I wanted to mention one of the big motivators for me, in thinking about what the brethren of the common life represented, and I want to kind of flip to the image of a certain person who I've been friends with for a long time, not directly. I've never met Frederick Douglass in person, but to me, one of the things that had a lasting impact on me as a youth is reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography. He writes really, even in his lengthy autobiography, there are moments of poetic and very lucid insight into what was the turning point in his thinking. And he describes a point where he, as a child, was being taught by his master and mistress, who he lived with. The woman of the house was teaching him to read. And as he was, in the course of this, something happened. The master found out and discovered this was going on, and he forbade the mistress of the house from doing it. And Douglass was in the next room, and Frederick Douglass was a boy. He was, I don't know, he may have been like 8 years old, and I can't remember exactly how much, but he never forget this, because he overheard this conversation, and it changed his life forever. And I would describe it as a profoundly bitter-sweet moment, because what he lucidly describes is hearing the master say that if you teach this boy to read, you will unfit him to be a slave. And Douglass talked about how this both profoundly, like he was hurt by this, right? That she couldn't do this. But at the same time, it also it's almost like he was describing a eureka moment. All of a sudden, he made the connection. So if I develop my mind, if I learn to read, then I actually am unfitting myself to be a slave. He said from that moment on, this lit a fire inside of him. And, even though he wasn't allowed, he tells stories about how he would come up with clever ways to teach himself to read. He would trick, when he was sent out on errands, he would trick the little white boys in the neighborhood into teaching him his letters, and he would walk around with little articles that he would try to read, and just not only trick people to teaching him and ask questions, but he really began to develop a fire inside of himself. And it was this sense and understanding Douglass as a whole, the entirety of what he represented, that completely enamored me. I have been I have been struck by this ever since, especially myself growing up in the United States. I was an immigrant, but when I was about 3 or 4, with my family, we were political refugees, but I grew up in the Black community. And as somebody who was always identified with African American history, I completely identified with what he did. And this concept of freedom as tied to education was something that began to make a lot of sense to me. And I wanted to point out that, number one, that's kind of what draws me close and makes me really interested in the work of the Brethren of the Common Life, because this was understood. Number one, this was explicitly understood by the likes of Dante and Petrarch, and it was obviously very clearly a motivating factor for the individuals, the Gerard Groot, and more, and just more importantly, the people that were coming out of for example, the people that were the products of the Brotherhood of the Common Life education. And they were actually the brothers and sisters of the Common Life. The first house, educational house, or religious house that they founded was a woman's house, a house of poor women. And this was and Groot, who was very who was kind of disenchanted with the vanity and flaunting of wealth that he saw among the church elite. He wasn't interested in, he was born in an aristocratic family. He wasn't interested in that. So he had he inherited a massive house, and he donated it to these women, these poor women. And he actually helped them develop a constitution for how they would operate. And after that, he gave advice, he advised them, but he allowed them essentially to run it themselves. And then with his collaboration with Florentius, this then would become an official. They then built a men's version of this, and then it began to spread. It began in the Netherlands, in a place called Deventer, and would later spread into other parts of the Netherlands, into Germany, and then eventually, to places like England and France, and then and we're not. And aside from discussion of their specific places where they were specifically set up, there was also a broader impact that they would make far beyond places where they were situated. But as I was saying before, the people that came out of this were people that we all, if we study the history of humanist thinking, one of the people that was educated by the brethren was what somebody considered the leading Renaissance humanist, Erasmus of Rotterdam. And Thomas More, who was a close friend of Erasmus, was educated by the brethren. And then you have people, and probably one of the most significant geniuses of the Renaissance, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, was educated by the brethren. One of the things that they all have in common was their emphasis on the idea of the common good, right? So this is not a matter of nominalism, of this idea of a common life, but the whole concept that Groot and these guys were emphasizing was that Christianity we should have a rebirth of Christianity and getting back to this idea of imitation of Christ. In fact, that book becomes the title of a book that would later become very famous, written by a leading member of the Brethren of the Common Life. So the book was called The Imitation of Christ. And this book would actually, it's often referred to as, outside of the Bible, probably the best-selling religious book in history since that time. It's had a lot of influence even beyond the suppression and the fading out of the Brethren of the Common Life. It's still a widely influential book. But this idea of the imitation of Christ was something they saw as something that the church, but also society as a whole, should get back to. And one of the key things for me that motivated me in thinking about this subject was, how this movement gave birth to this concept of what we know today, which wasn't very popular in the Middle Ages when the Brethren of Common Life came into being. But the cultivation of this notion of the common good and the general welfare, the Brethren were crucial in shaping this. And we know that because of the key individuals that came out of the Brethren movement, Erasmus, Nicholas of Cusa, Thomas More. The idea that government's primary responsibility should not be the protection of the property of the aristocracy, but that is to spread this principle of agape and this idea of the common good, what became known as the general welfare, right? Which is a term that a lot of neoliberal economists and oligarchs hate. And so, as you might expect, the Brethren had a lot of opposition within the church, but they also had a lot of friends, because there was a um, a significant support for this, for the humanist ideas and education and intent and the kind of virtue that this movement represented. And so there were people in the church saying, "You guys are creating these religious houses, and it's not sanctioned." And there were all kinds of efforts to shut them down. Now, Johannes Gerson, as you can see here, with person who's pictured here, would was the person who would took it upon himself uh, to defend, to put forth the legal defense of the Brethren of the Common Life. And it actually was, to me, the way that the kinds of arguments that he made were reminiscent to me of the kind of discussion. Any of you who are familiar with Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, you might remember the kind of arguments that Martin Luther King made to his fellow clergymen who were, while he was in prison, he responded to them. But their criticisms were, "You guys are doing, you guys are, they were telling Martin Luther King that you should, stay behind the pulpit and stop trying to do these things that are not really part of the picture and job of a member of the clergy." And one of the things that he reminded them of was that the purpose of Christianity is this idea of loving humanity and caring and having a passion for justice and good. And this was precisely the kind of argument that Johannes Gerson made in reply to some of the bureaucrats in the church who wanted to suppress the brothers and sisters of the common life. And he pointed out, they're not doing anything wrong. They're not disagreeing with the church. In fact, they're better examples of the work of Christ and the apostles than many of the established approaches. And he went on to demonstrate this, and in a way that to me was really resonant with the powerful arguments that Martin Luther King made. Now, unlike Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, the Brethren of the Common Life, they were not an explicitly political movement. And at the time, they really couldn't be. In fact, I would say that it's because of their work that we had the opportunity to be as politically engaged as we are now. But the type of argument that was made of getting to the principle of what the Brethren of the Common Life are doing, and in a certain sense, almost in an inspiring way, shaming people, realizing these people are actually just because they're not officially sanctioned, they're regular people, and they're doing what regular people should do, which is the imitation of Christ and educating themselves in virtue. And so these kind of efforts to these kind of interventions in support of the brethren had to be made constantly, because from the moment they came into existence, there were constant, nonstop efforts to suppress what they were doing. And I would say at this point, before I say any more, I want to welcome any questions or thoughts throughout. I just want to make sure people are very well aware that there's that I don't necessarily need to give a straight through lecture, but I'll stop, take a moment in case Matt has any. Matt, do you have any thoughts at this stage that you would like me to dilate on, or I can keep moving?
No, I don't want to break your flow or momentum because this is great, but definitely there's things bubbling away in my mind. So when the time comes, I'm sure you're gonna get some good
Okay.
questions coming at you.
Sure, no problem.
Actually, no, I got one question.
Sure.
I've heard it said that people like Dante did not necessarily have access to Plato's writings, that those only became more known later on. Was there any direct evidence of Augustine or Plato directly being cited by the leading figures around the brethren at this early stage, or was that something that just kind of like emerged later on?
Oh no, this was actually. I'm glad you asked that. The brethren were actually toward the end of Gerard Groot's life. the brethren, because, as I mentioned, they were under significant and constant threat of attack. And because of his connections, Gerard Groot, was able to help coordinate efforts to counter these attacks against the brethren. But toward the end of his life, he directed Florentius to at least begin to create, to consolidate some of their houses into officially sanctioned religious houses, and that gets to the issue of Augustine. In fact, they filed themselves as Augustinian movement, right? And so they were, explicitly set themselves they saw themselves in the image of Augustine, in the sense that Augustine was, as you well know, was marinated in the classical culture of Plato and Cicero, and he was very much, so they definitely were aware, and also, as for Plato, to my knowledge, I think one of the important things to note in this regard, because I don't know exactly whether Dante had, how much access he may or may not have, but I know for a fact that in that time period there was much of the writings of classical Greek thought were lost to Europe, thanks to some of the problems imposed by the Roman Empire and its collapse. It itself had degenerated and really harmed, discontinued some of the best of European thought. But I'm glad you mentioned this, because Petrarch, one of the people who in the previous century was advocating for, like Dante was advocating for education in the vernacular and so on, Petrarch was, had seen how much decay there was in European civilization. But instead of just giving up, what he did was he sought to revive this. And Petrarch would single-handedly, and this is a very important part of this picture, he began the process, which then made it his mission to find these old transcripts and manuscripts of Greek and Latin philosophers and scientists and thinkers. And he would literally, you could imagine him literally. There was stories of him, hearing about a manuscript in some remote castle somewhere in a mountain, and he'd be hitting the trails on his mule in pursuit of a manuscript. And that wasn't an isolated case. He made it his mission to seek these things out, hunting for manuscripts. And he salvaged single-handedly many, I don't remember, but many ancient manuscripts, because he saw, not because nobody else had the resource to do so, but he had the motivation. And so much of Plato, that involved salvaging much of Plato's works, many of the classic works of Cicero that had been lost. And so it's an excellent question, because this was, this kind of Petrarch's work, along with some of the other pre-Renaissance humanists, created the basis for then the continuation of that mission through the work of the brethren.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, just as you can see here, there's just some examples of how they, because one of the things that was clear about the brethren is, in a point that was frequently made by Groot, and then Thomas à Kempis, who I'd mentioned, who wrote the Imitation of Christ. À Kempis joined the brethren toward the very end of Groot's life. So he was kind of a second generation person in the Brethren of the Common Life. In fact, Thomas à Kempis's brother, his older brother, became the first head of one of the male houses, the first male or common living situation. So this was so his brother joined, and then Thomas à Kempis joined. And à Kempis, who kind of encapsulating the intention of their educational system, made clear that it's for them, they saw it as important to develop the characteristics of virtue, just like Cicero. And for them, while education was important, that you could be the most learned in terms of academic exposure. You might be able to memorize 1,000 books and recite them from memory, but that if you did not have character and virtue, that was completely useless. And in many ways, it's very reminiscent of many of the discussions we've had, Matthew, of Friedrich Schiller's polemics against the bread-fed scholars. And it is unfortunately what we're seeing today in academia, where university professors are being reduced to the status of corporate sales, so to speak. But for them, for the brethren of the common life, the purpose of education, especially of the young, had to combine the best of a universal holistic education with a sense of character development. And so 3 times a day, you would have what they commonly would do is they would read together and discuss selections from the Bible, and then they would have if you read The Imitation of Christ, there's a lot of spiritual exercises that are typical of what they would do. And in fact, it's easy to get. I encourage people to find a good translation of it. And so, and one of the important things, they believed in, loving warning as opposed to harsh punishment. They wanted to inculcate a love for research. They wanted people to delve among original works, classics, and not just, again, these musty and Aristotelian textbooks. And then again, the vernacular language was big, and again, very revolutionary idea. And I really invite you to chew on this idea, that because education, the culture of education up until then, it was only for aristocrats and those who could afford it. But they invited the poor pupils in, and they were given money for books and ink and the paper they needed, and the needs of students were met. And so this was a very profound, a very profound thing historically. People who came from working or poor families like Nicholas of Cusa and Thomas More became some of the most revolutionary thinkers that would go on to make our political existence possible. And so, and I have a picture here of Cicero, who was one of the key figures that was kind of emblematic and and his argument on behalf of this kind of education was seen as an example, and his political defense of the idea of a republic and the Renaissance humanist drive towards republican forms of government, where the human individual and the sacredness of the individual is a pillar of society. That's that essentially this was not a thing that was done, but the revival of this literature was seen as crucial for this. And so while the brethren of the common life didn't run around and demand the toppling of terrible governments, their discussion of the deep philosophical principles of Plato and Cicero were crucial. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this image of Cicero is I was reminded of some of the individuals that have been, seen as crucial Renaissance figures. Because for a long time, it was perplexing to me. How is it? If you remember Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, right? Cicero is seen as the missing. Shakespeare basically identifies and points to Cicero as the missing piece, as kind of one of those, as a person who, had he been integrated into the conspiracy to save the Roman Republic instead of what ended up occurring. Shakespeare has a very poetic allusion to this, right? And so I thought to myself, it's very remarkable that that would be kind of part of a play that people would see. And but by understanding the work of the brethren and the fight to revive classical culture in this way, we then begin to understand how there was an audience for what Shakespeare was writing, right? About the missing ideas of Cicero that caused Rome to fail, right? And in a certain sense, that was a powerful polemic by Shakespeare and others, and that it was a powerful polemic for what society needed in the time that they were operating. They're saying society needs this now, right, to avoid the kind of doom that took down Rome, and so it's so Cicero is crucial, but you see Raphael's School of Athens, and to me this is fascinating because I was thinking about recently Leonardo da Vinci and all the many great Renaissance figures that emerged in this time. There's no even if there's no direct links between people like Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli that I know of to the brethren of the common life, they were all Machiavelli. They were very much integrated into the world of humanist thinking, and that was largely an outgrowth of what Petrarch and then later the Brethren of the Common Life created. So this gets back to this issue of how creativity and leadership shapes the social climate in which great thinkers emerge. And as we've already identified, a lot of the great thinkers we've mentioned came directly out of the Brethren, but then you have to then think about how the culture of enthusiasm for creativity and curiosity and also the optimism the optimism that comes from imagining a different world, a just new world where people of all classes can actually get education and advance themselves. That was one of the crucial polemics of the humanists and the Brethren of the Common Life. That and this goes back to Petrarch and Dante, that leadership is not defined by heredity or wealth, but it's defined by the qualities cultivated in the individuals. And then if you look at what they did to fight for the development of these qualities, you see their outlook. And so for us, we might take a lot of this stuff for granted, but it's so important not to. This is why it's so important to study history, because there was a fight. The chaos, it might look like a chaotic process giving birth to a new idea, but it's the fight that they engaged in that made this concept of the common good possible. And so that's important. And here you see some of the people that were influenced by, educated by, or directly influenced by the culture of the created by the Brotherhood. Just examples. There's so many more. And I wanted to, point out that.
Hey, Alex?
Yeah.
Just quick, I just realized that the screen, there's my picture of RTF or my face sometimes on the screen that everyone can see, but it's covering up some of the images. Is it
Oh, I
possible
see.
to? Yeah, so sometimes my face cuts off. some
Oh,
of the
I
stuff
see.
you're
I
showing?
see.
Just a
Okay, let
little
me
bit.
see if I could do. I can maybe I can adjust that.
Yeah, if it's too much of a hassle, don't worry about it.
Oh no, I'm glad you mentioned it. I didn't realize it. But yes, this. So one of the things that's useful again is to, as I was mentioning before, is to think about how these types of ideas um, create the opportunity. You know, in fact, both in terms of the educational movement they created and in terms of the spread of this concept associated with the common good. How did it lead to this unleashing of creativity in arts and science during the Renaissance? And so, as I I'm pulling something up real quick. One thing that is useful to understand, which is quite important, is this is the fact that the way that the Brethren of the Common Life funded what they did was largely through the production of books, and that becomes extremely important. When you think about the fact that that they were what they were doing was prior to the creation of the printing press. Um, and I would say, and I would submit to you that what they did was so impactful in their transcribing of books by hand. They developed methods of doing this because this was something they were committed to. They weren't just, I mean, obviously they were doing it because it was important first and foremost. But again, this was a big part of funding their operations, since they weren't necessarily going to be getting grants and funds from aristocrats. Now, um, they did, not to go into all the weeds, but it's important to understand that of the impact they had on literature, because prior to the creation of the printing press, 25% of all of the books in Europe came out of were produced by the brothers and sisters of the common life. That's very significant. that and so they developed very advanced infrastructure to do this, and it was methodological infrastructure, not necessarily, of course they had, because they were doing things by hand. It was important that they, because things were done by hand at that time, there were a lot of errors that transcribers would make. And um, and what the Brethren of the Common Life did was they developed very, very advanced ways, because they would basically have people in a room all transcribing together at the same time. But they developed techniques to mark and catch errors and typos that were made by previous translators or transcribers. And then they would develop ways to make note of things that were glaring errors, and then go back and figure out ways to correct them. And that created an environment where they became very relied upon, and but also imagine how much that impacts the culture. That level of pushing the limits of handwritten transcription created an environment where the printing press could later succeed. They created markets for ancient Greek and Latin texts, right? And so that because of the work they did, there was an explosive demand for these works. And so one of the things that happened when the printing presses were created, the Gutenberg, for example, was not accidentally close to these circles of the Brethren of the Common Life. And a lot of people that developed these methods of transcription were then later employed to work on the printing press. And furthermore, a lot of the books that made the success of the printing press possible were feeding into markets that had been previously created, demands that had been previously generated by the book production methods of the Brethren of the Common Life. So it's actually a very important lesson in physical economy, how pushing the limits sometimes in order to sometimes create the acceleration towards a more advanced technology, you got to push the limits of your previous level of development. As we have studied in the course of many discussions on physical economy, this is very important. And you got to and again, and that's without even before we take into account the fact that we're dealing with the dissemination of profound ideas that would then become the raw material, the spiritual raw material for the development of the modern nation state in Europe, and then, of course, the discourses that led to and political fights that led to the American Revolution. Some people may recall that some of the key literature that became the bedrock and the philosophical fodder for the founding fathers were the arguments of Cicero, was Machiavelli's study of Rome and the processes in the development of and failure of the Roman Republic. And so this is not, these are, say the world, history in the world seems to be a small place when we're talking about profound ideas. So this is one of the reasons why this is exciting. This is a subject that's very exciting for anyone who's ever been a political organizer, because you begin to understand that there is no separation between creating the infrastructure to make ideas available and that fight, for this concept of justice and the kind of social transformation that comes from fighting for those ideas. And so, if we've some people who've distributed pamphlets attacking Dick Cheney and his push for perpetual war, and seeing the impact of that in shaping public discourse, know that. And so, it was very exciting for me to see how the ideas that were central to the founding of the U.S. Republic were made possible by the dissemination of these ideas by the Brethren of the Common Life and Renaissance humanism in general, including the figures like Erasmus and Thomas More, who were direct products of the brothers and sisters of the common life. So this is, again, very exciting for me because, as I mentioned, with the arguments of Martin Luther King and the philosophy of this of a man who became, he wasn't in the beginning of his political journey, but he became a defender of the U.S. Republic and its Constitution, Frederick Douglass. These are universal ideas, and some of these ideas are, that some of the ideas that Frederick Douglass identified weren't, were things, this idea that education makes you free. This is not something, these are not things that need to be necessarily learned in the book, and they can be spread culturally, but these are things that can be verified across history. And as a young boy, prior to any exposure in reading, Douglass discovered this. There's something universal in us that allows that, but also there's something in the transmission of culture that gives us the opportunity sometimes to get an accelerated view of that. So with that being said, I want to conclude and give people an opportunity to ask any questions, if I can answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. That was great. And I guess a question. I just ordered Thomas à Kempis's the Imitation of Christ as you were speaking on Amazon. So I'm gonna bring that into my curriculum because I find that myself. I sometimes dig into the weeds and map out the evil networks manifesting, as Gnostic cults through the power structures of the church and its various, splinter groups over time. And it's easy to lose sight of the positive principles of true Christianity as far as like living and walking the walk morally and intellectually of what Christ actually just demonstrated in his life and how that was able to be protected, incubated such that these nasty death cults acting Christian were not successful and were at various times very, very, very much defeated by those who were subscribing to a system of natural law in this battle to emancipate humanity. So that's extremely important that you just this out. I guess my first question is when did the Brethren of the Common Life kind of peter out? And was it kind of corrupted from within, kind of like Plato's Academy after Plato died, a few generations later was infiltrated and turned into something bad? Or did it just sort of like end in a more like bombastic way, or did it just transmogrify into something else good, also good?
Oh, that's an excellent, very excellent question. One of the things that's clear is that it was in the wake of the very problematic Reformation, Protestant Reformation. In the wake of that the brothers and sisters of common life began to lose their influence and ultimately disappear from history. Now, there's important things to be noticed in that process, which is that the Renaissance humanist impulse that was the emblem of the brothers and sisters of the common life. The banner for that was largely held by Erasmus, one of its products, one of the Brethren's products, who despite let me see. Okay.
I just ended your screen share.
Oh, that's cool. No, I just wanted to. Oh, good. Okay, good. Sorry. I was since you ended the screen share, I don't have to worry about weird things popping up. So one of the things that occurred was what we know is that both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation were, as usual, manipulated by imperial interests. There's evidence indicating that the Henry VIII, who was responsible for beheading our dear Thomas More, Henry VIII was being manipulated by Venetian figures, and also one of the things that we see is that the Venetian playing both sides of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, because one of the victims of this whole process were the ideas of the propagated by people like Thomas More and Erasmus and the figures coming from the Brethren, that not only the common good and the concept of the modern nation state sacred, but they were also, which is easy to find, they were also massive advocates of peace and cooperation. They constantly polemicized against war, right? This was, you look at and then they were also constantly attacking the empiricist science being promoted by the Venetians and the what became the Anglo-Dutch establishment, this kind of empiricism. You see, Francois Rabelais. Some people like Erasmus wrote both philosophical works on this, but they also lampooned it by writing humorous works. Rabelais, who was a friend of Erasmus, also made some very powerful polemics against the empiricism coming out of Venice and England at the time, and they were also really keen on how destructive war was. So one of the things that happened with in the wake of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation is they unleashed chaos. They didn't resolve anything, and what happened was Luther's work intentionally was vectored towards sabotaging the Renaissance humanists, and in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned the Aristotle's infiltration of Plato's Academy. because Luther, for a very brief time, did get exposure to the brethren. Very briefly, I think it may have been a matter of a few months where he partook in this learning. In fact, early in his life, he was a proponent of classical learning. The problem with Luther was he had a lot of, from reading some of what he had to say, it's clear he struggled with mental issues, and he's the kind of person that, although I don't have any direct evidence myself, he's the kind of person that could easily be manipulated into doing, taking on a reckless role in something like this. But I don't think he was a mastermind of anything. I think he was he seemed like the type of person that is easy to manipulate. But one of the things that became clear is that Luther, unlike the Renaissance humanists, he was not interested in humanism. He was not interested in protecting the interests of the general welfare. He was kind of more of a pet of the aristocracy. And so from that standpoint, again, more to the question was, Luther was kind of almost like an agent provocateur, where Erasmus and the brethren may have been critical about the hypocrisies and problems in the church, but they were all doing it from the standpoint, including Cusa, of trying to create a revolution within the church and and not creating. They weren't interested in creating religious schisms. Whereas Luther did things which not only pushed for those schisms, and the Venetians also pushed this in England, and not coincidentally in succession, in close succession. What you see with Luther is that he was not a humanist. He didn't have a commitment to making people's lives better. That was clear in terms of thinking about the consent of the governed and so on and so forth. He was a religious ideologue, whereas the Christian humanists did not separate the well-being of people and their ability to develop fully as humans from everything else. Luther didn't have such interests, and so that makes him a good tool. But again, your analogy, the image of Aristotle. The difference is Aristotle probably was very intentional, unlike Luther. Aristotle played a very intentional role, whereas I think Luther was kind of mentally unstable and probably just had a lot of strings that could be pulled.
Right. That's a good differentiation. I appreciate that. All right, there's a few people lined up in queue, so I'm just going to defer to a few people who have questions for you. Let's go with Monty first, then Steven, and then we'll just run down the list. So Monty, are you still there?
Yes, I'm a little late to the show here, but I appreciate your providing this. My question is, where were the Brotherhood of the Common Life primarily centrally located, and how far physically was their expanse and their total numbers during that period?
Oh, that's a good question. Some of this, there are numbers. I don't have them all in front of me, but I can tell you that there's also not as much as there could be. Let me see. I may have some specific stuff in my notes about their numbers, but for example, they started in the Netherlands in the town of Deventer, and they began to spread to other parts of the Netherlands, into Lower Germany, eventually to England and parts of France. So they were pretty expansive, and it was one of the things that was very important about this is that they began to create a culture where people who were not part of the aristocracy could get education, and although there there were some, to give you an example, while there's no direct evidence or no documentation for somebody like Joan of Arc being educated by the brethren, as a young woman who was clearly classically educated, without the the culture created by the brethren, that would not have been possible, right? Because she was a highly educated, aesthetically educated young woman, and there was evidence that there were people associated with the brethren near in the area that she lived, right? I'm just bringing this up not to make a linear connection, but to think about how the ideas of the brethren did spread, even far beyond. At a certain point, they reached a critical mass where the culture was more powerful than the locale, right? But again, I do recall getting some general, having some general numbers, and if you follow up with me, I can get you. Actually, if you feel free to pass on my email, Matthew, because I have numbers somewhere, but I know many of their schools would have like 2,000, 2,500 pupils. It's pretty remarkable, and people would come from distant towns to participate, and it was pretty profound culture.
All right, will do. And I'll make sure that I get your email. I'll try to get it and put it in this chat group here so people who are on live can access it. Yeah. There's also I remember years ago I'd read in an old Fidelio a decent article. I don't know if you remember what it was, but I think it went through a little bit of the mapping of the geographical expanse of the Brotherhood of Common Life, and I forget who even wrote it, but it's something probably worth revisiting. I can maybe put in the description box as well when I upload this video, which might partially at least answer some of that question from Monty as well. And if you have any additional links, Alex, that you would recommend that I
Yes,
include when I upload this video on YouTube, then send them my way and I'll put that in the supplementary reading section.
absolutely.
Um,
And the yeah, like I said, they expand. Have some of these notes indicate that there's a lot to be said about their numbers, but that will require some further follow up. But they began in the Netherlands, as I mentioned, in Deventer and eventually Svol, um, and then they eventually spread to into the across the Low Countries, cities like Hoom, Amersfoort, Delft, Brussels, and Utrecht, and expanded throughout Germany, and later, developed locales in England and France. But for more details, we'll talk later.
right. Thank you. All right, Stephen, if you're still there, I'm guessing you'd like to pose your question yourself, or do you want me to read it for you? Stephen?
Yeah, I can do it, Matt. Thanks.
Right.
Alex, love the
Hi.
lecture. Thanks so much for doing that. Really appreciate it. Towards the end, you mentioned a term or thought, the educational infrastructure necessary to engender sort of the thinking for correct political discourse and all that sort of stuff. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on how those who oppose that sort of future or today with the common good in mind, how they act to circumvent that, and what we might need to do to kind of protect ourselves, insulate ourselves, and institute that educational infrastructure.
Oh, that's an excellent question. On the first part, that would probably require a whole other conversation or presentation. But it's a fun enough thing to at least reflect on a little bit, which is that today, and this is one of the things that I realize is not new. One of the things that the Venetians learned was that humanist thinking was dangerous, right? And then they saw it. They literally saw it as a state policy to control science, right, and to control ideas. And there were also a lot of political propaganda elements involved in that. But today, one of the things that's, that we see in higher ed institutions is we see regimes that turn higher education institutions, effectively redefine their purpose into the mold of corporate structures that are driven. So today, one of the things that they do is they define. Actually, if you think about what in a modern nation state, especially in the U.S. Republic, the purpose of education is to create a holistic process in which the person can develop their entire being. And this is kind of rooted in a lot of the work that this is probably most well articulated by Friedrich Schiller's whole concept of education and aesthetical education. But the concept of the reason why you want an educational system is you want people to be creative, right? They might branch off into the sciences and so on, but if you study the greatest scientific thinkers that we've had in the modern era, their education was in the classics, right? Was in music and art and poetry. And then these are the leading scientists, whether it's Gauss or Cardan or whatever, that they were fully universally educated. But the purpose of education is to cultivate people who actually are going to help reproduce your society, not only reproduce your society, but push it forward. And that's that mysterious thing that is attributed to Ben Franklin after they created the U.S. Constitutional Republic. He said, "We created a republic if you can keep it." I mean, that's the purpose of education, not to indoctrinate, but to educate and create the kind of people with the curiosity and enthusiasm to maintain that high purpose. And I say that to contrast it with the fact that today we explicitly say that higher ed is essentially a corporation, and that it's driven by profit margins and so on and so forth. And so one of the outcomes of that has been that across the country, and people are shocked, but they shouldn't be shocked if they understand what drove it. We're shutting down the classics, philosophy departments, classics departments, right? Can you imagine? There was a time where these ideas were suppressed on the threat of death, right? But today, because of the under the rubric of corporatized higher ed, we voluntarily allow these things to disappear because they don't stand up to the measure of profitability, right? And so what our universities are doing is now saying we're going to essentially we're trying to educate people to create ready-made to fit into ready-made jobs, right? Meanwhile, of course, our societies really aren't. We're not employing the general population, right? But higher ed, in a sense, has created an environment where the corporations and people who are the modern lords of the estate can come in and cherry pick the people that are ready-made employees for their efforts. So education, in a sense, has been subverted from that standpoint. And of course, the other part of your question, which I would just mention, is that those of us who've been political organizers have seen that since about the mid '90s, our mass media hasn't really been great, ever, but it has gotten dramatically worse. What happened since the mid '90s was they did an intentional mass consolidation of mass media, especially in the Western world, where from the mid '90s on, they rapidly bought up all the local radio stations and TV stations and newspapers, right? And of course, with the advent of the internet, they're trying to buy up the power to control algorithms. I saw the ADL bragging that how they have an influence on the so-called fact checking in Facebook, right? So what are they doing? Which is part of the same process. Is I was mind blown. I was recently hearing that Netanyahu complaining that we've got to get better at algorithms. People are complaining about genocide because we don't have enough control with algorithms, And so I guess this was like a day or two ago. So the logic of Netanyahu and people that control him is that, we need the solution is not to stop genocide. It's that we have to, convince people that we're the good guys, right? So basically, again, there's a lot that's being done, but I think the key, this is one of the very important reasons, is a profoundly good question. And to get to the second part of your question, going back to the thing that motivated me to present this subject, is, as Frederick Douglass understood, that this mission, any movement that would liberate people politically, has to be driven by education. You can't have movements. Listen, I'm a big fan of picket signs and hurling polemics and being on the street and educating, but that has to be the entry point to drawing people into being inspired and drawing them into an inspired effort to study the deeper how we are in a deeper way situated in history, including philosophy and science and so again, it's not that when you go out and have picket signs or protest against war or have a table, you don't need to necessarily read them the entirety of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey right there. Right? But you want to create the environment where people have the motivation, maybe to work together on Plato or Homer, but with you, but to understand why it's important. Like, to be like Frederick Douglass, who once he got the point that this is where freedom is, he said, I'm going to find it by any means, right? And so again, the solution is to create a movement that has an uncompromising attitude about, making that kind of development, full development, aesthetical development, a pillar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the rigor, right? The intellectual, moral rigor of really being disciplined enough to know when you're speaking about things that are simply an opinion that you haven't really earned versus like real knowledge that's a qualitatively superior that you have earned because you've done the work, you've worked it out, you own it, and can build upon it and play with it with creative insights that you wouldn't have if you were just memorizing something that might actually be true, but you have no room for improvisation, for improvement upon that, qualitatively speaking. So very, very, I love the way you just put that composition together very, very quickly. Yeah, that speaks deeply to me. There's a few more questions. Vic Hughes, are you still there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
All right, it's all yours.
Hi. You covered a lot. My question was about basically, having enlightened myself, and Matt's been a great help there. But when you start talking to a lot of people, even fairly highly educated people, they go into what I've always thought is like restricted thinking. But according to your Frederick Douglass quote, I think that they've been educated into slave thinking. And the slave only, he's got very narrow boundaries on what he could ask. So a lot of that has been covered in your former stuff. If you have a comment on that, that's good. But what I was going to actually ask is, during the COVID stuff, one of the things that totally appalled me, and I fought against it early on, was that statements like, don't do your own research. Listen to the experts, stuff like that. That is about as antithetical to what you're talking about as I can imagine. Any thoughts on that too?
Oh my God. I saw an article the other day, and I nearly flipped out of my seat, but I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked that somebody would verbalize this. There was an article on, if you ever hear someone say, I'm going to do my own research, basically then saying that means that they're, marching toward authoritarianism or or something, to this effect. And I just found it shocking because, number one, listen, even in the time period that we're talking about, with the consolidation of mass media and so on, even as recently as 15 to 20 years ago, what it meant to be a progressive has changed, right? Today's progressives are silent about genocide. And if you look at who the progressives were in American politics 15, 20 years ago, you're dealing with people like John Conyers and Dennis Kucinich. Whatever the problem might be, they were always polemical against war and things like genocide. And you would never hear a progressive say, don't think for yourself. But today, what's going on? What you got is this idea, because we're looked at, it speaks to a very interesting philosophy about what it means to be human, right? That ideas are just kind of, glitches of the brain, right? They don't understand that they don't recognize anything universal. And so I agree with you that people are conditioned and educated to think this way. And I do think that it's very important to take the position of being Socratic, right? This is why it's so important to study people like Nicholas of Cusa, the great thinker who really developed, not only as a scientist, he developed a lot of scientific principles, but he was someone who was revolutionizing statescraft. But one of the works of his that kind of should be read by everyone is this concept on learned ignorance, and how do you develop knowledge? What does it mean to have knowledge? He's basically picking up on the work of Plato. And so I urge, one of the reasons why we have to study Plato and Cusa is because we have to begin to, we don't want to necessarily you don't want to be a sophist, right? Even if you happen to be right, it's not important just to be right on the issue, right? This question is how do you approach helping other people to think? And so one of the things that our enemies use, one of the methods our enemies use is actually they mix good ideas with things that suck, right? and so what happens is, in fact, that's one of the things you'll see is like a lot of the stuff that activists were exposing with the IMF and the World Bank, things that we were organizing against, and the central banking policies. What happens is now a lot of those ideas are being recycled and attacking central banks, but then mixing in a little bit of anti-Semitism, mixing in things about aliens, right? And so I hope I'm not offending anyone who believes in aliens. But what happens though is it's about mixing in things that are not necessarily rational with things that are, so that you can be lumped. So anybody who has a valid idea, it's easy to lump them into a category. So what I would say is, what's more important than seeking agreement with people is to help them situate themselves into a historic process, right? Get people out of issuism, right? A lot of people are radicalized around vaccines. Okay, but you got to get deeper than that. And so again, we don't need to. Our goal is not to win every battle, but to challenge people to have a deeper motivation. Because let's face it, single issues don't really motivate people. They might get people whipped up, but they're not going to get them to actually think more deeply, right?
Yep. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, Richard. Monsieur Olafsson.
Hi, Matt.
Hey.
Yeah. Greetings from Victoria. And thanks very much. I have to apologize that I missed most of the lecture because I had major computer technical problems, internet, so on. So I missed a lot of it. And I'm working on a book on transhumanism, so all comes back to Dante's essay on one world government, which he wrote. And I'm just wondering if you're familiar with De Monarchia, one world government.
Yes, it's actually, excuse me, it's been a long time, but I have some exposure to it. I can't claim to know it like the back of my hand, though.
Yeah, well, Dante broke the tyranny of Latinate verse. Cavalcanti and Dante and that group, and with Dante's great essay De Vulgaria Loquentia, which the common tongue. He brought the common tongue into poetry for the first time, and in his Dante had a dispute with Boniface VIII in I guess 1303, and that resulted in his exile, and he was he believed that the Pope should govern the spiritual realm, and the Holy Roman Emperor should govern the political realm, and because the spiritual realm was sacred and pure, and Boniface was not particularly a pure man, and the Holy Roman Empire is governed over the body, political body as well is corrupted. The flesh is corrupted, and so the Holy Roman Empire would hold all the corruption at bay.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm writing this in context of the one world government that's proposed.
And this is but it's also relevant because this gets to one of the things that Dante's trying to do, as well as the Renaissance humanists associated with Petrarch and later, for Petrarch and then later among the Renaissance humanists, including Lorenzo Valla.
Yeah,
they are fighting for the same principle, which is to attack this silly idea of basically the donation of Constantine, which and this notion that somehow there's and this is one of the key things that defines the Western fight of humanists. That's what they mean by the separation of church and state, is you can't have this imperialism that's this contrived imperial ideology, which is kind of created the ultramontane culture, which the Renaissance was created to fight, right? That we've got to have, which basically negates the idea in a real world sense, negates the idea that the central ideas of Christianity, the idea of human beings as in the image of the Creator, and have this right to development, and this right to political consent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say, but Dante was a big influence on that whole movement. What was I came in at the sort of just the last 10 minutes of your lecture. So what is the Brotherhood of the Common? What's the phrase that you used?
Oh, it's the Brotherhood of the Common Life. Richard, you're gonna have to watch the replay.
I'm gonna watch the whole thing. I want to come back
very soon.
Well, we can start over.
It's so fascinating.
Okay, all right, we're gonna start over. All right.
Yeah, start it again.
I appreciate your comments and your intervention, because Dante is very crucial, and I think that the book on vulgar eloquence, basically on discussion of the vernacular, is highly integrated into this, and it goes to what we're talking about the citizen ability. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
And I would just add one thing too. Like I've encountered some. There's a lot of people who are not inclined to read original writings, but they still try to piece together broad explanations to explain our predicament today and I found and I know you've detected, Richard. I could hear it in your discourse that Dante is a very positive figure in world history, but a lot of them they simply read the Monarchia and his arguments for world government, or at least the idea of a. I mean, he's not that. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but they're like,
Yeah.
oh, see, the oligarchy is a Dante conspiracy. It's a
Right.
like that. That's that, and they don't actually read the content of what he's saying because there's an idea that great power comes great moral responsibility and obligation to cultivate the best in everybody if you're going to merit that type of power. And if you don't, as the oligarchy never does, and treat people instead like human slaves, then guaranteed any type of use of power is going to be abusive and destructive. So they always kind of miss that nuance that's so important.
Yeah, I consider Dante a very very important figure in his argument with Boniface is kind of a central feature to the birth of modernity, and so I'm anyways, I was really interested to hear your thoughts, Alexander, and
I'm happy to stay in touch. Feel free to contact me if you'd like. But in any event, thank you for being here and asking that question.
Hey, I see Jerry. Jerry, I'd love to get your thoughts, man. I saw you're
not picking that up. Might be Mike.
No, it's fine. Here, I'll put you on mute there. Jerry, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of what we went through or what Alex went through today. I see Jerry trying to. Yeah, there he is.
Okay, can you hear me here? The dinosaur playing with the electronics here. No, I really, really liked your presentation, Alex, and I just wanted to make a comment just on my thinking as I watched it, because when you were talking about Frederick Douglass right at first, and he was saying how knowledge made him unfit to be a slave, and I like that, but knowledge per se doesn't make us free. But then later, you were talking about people getting excited and enthusiasm for it, and in my mind it went, okay, knowledge makes us unfit to be a slave, but it's the enthusiasm for knowledge that sets us free. So I just wanted to know if you wanted to comment on it. And I just wanted to thank you for your enthusiastic presentation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a good question. Yeah, and that gets into and I think for me, when I see what Frederick Douglass is talking about, I see it with the intention, with the in the context of what the Brethren of the Common Life did, because for Frederick Douglass, that enthusiasm came with a very virtuous idea, right? And the number one, children, there's a level of freedom for a young boy who sees himself as kind of climbing and growing, and then to make that connection, the deeper connection of freedom, right? That created a kind of revolution in his mind. But yes, absolutely, and that's one of the things that the Brethren of the Common Life understood, that there was a deeper thing that inspired them and Petrarch on an earlier level, because they realized, wait a minute, this is why Groot, who was interested in learning and study, he realized that there was something dead about the academic approach to so-called knowledge acquisition. It's, it goes back to what the difference between is, Plato's fight in defining the difference between knowledge and just learning, right? The sophists were good at learning. It's actually really interesting. A lot of the modern concept of an encyclopedia, right, comes from sophistry, which is they were literally like, you can ask me anything because I've read so much and memorized so much, right? But yet you see what happens in the difference between Socrates and the sophists is Socrates represents enthusiasm and curiosity and a passion for discovery. And the sophists, who were the predecessors for the encyclopedia, they literally were, hey, ask me anything about any subject, right? And so that's a profound difference. But part of the enthusiasm comes from and this was understood very clearly by Socrates, is there's a level of slavery involved in taking the approach of sophistry. Because, if you don't have a learned ignorance methodology, if you don't have an approach that's driven by curiosity and not, and not fixed assumptions, then you don't have the ability to liberate yourself from false assumptions. But also, it gets, when you get to the level of what Frederick Douglass made, that this eureka discovery, it actually has to do with a sense of identity. Your sense of identity as associated with what it means to be fully human, right? How can you walk around as a human if you don't have the freedom to actually develop your mind? And once you realize that, so that's one of the challenges. We're kind of in a dilemma in our society, because our society, we are all educated in this paradigm of empiricism and positivism. That's largely the dominant, with some rare exceptions in our society. That's kind of what we were marinated in. So there are these false dichotomies, right, where the distinction between knowledge and learning get fuzzy, right? So yeah, I appreciate, it's an excellent question, because you can't, the brethren of the common life realized that the real enthusiasm that drove them to do the revolutionary breakthroughs in book production, that drove them to make this education available to people in ways that never occurred in history in that way, that came from enthusiasm, from realizing this is connected to virtue, to character, to the development of character, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. And we have to reintegrate into that sense. In a sense, we have to shift our language culture where we begin to understand. Because keep in mind, in time of until Socrates made the intervention, sophistry was considered learning, right? The term sophistry developed a negative connotation because of the revolution created by Plato and Socrates. And so we have to do the same thing today to address what you very insightfully point out about that knowledge as it's understood in today's academic halls, that doesn't produce liberation or freedom.
That's great. It's a great point, because like sophistry as a term just means like the wisdom holders, or those who own wisdom, as if it's a thing that you could like carry around with you, and then dispense for those who have money. Whereas a philosopher is somebody who has the enthusiasm, the yearning, the hunger, the love for the wisdom. And it's not the wisdom that they hold, but it's always this, like you said, this learned ignorance, this self-awareness that there's always more that we can learn, and that every time we learn something true, we're more aware of how much more we still can learn. It's both exciting as well as kind of, it's this mixed feeling, right? Of humbling while also empowering at the same time, these two opposites that tend to grow simultaneously, which Aristotelians can't understand. It's either one or the other. You're going to be more humble or you're going to be more proud, but you can't be both at the same time. That makes no sense. Yeah, it's very good. I got a question for you, man. As somebody who's like engaged right now in modern pedagogy and education, are there any venues that you have found who are doing it, or dynamics in our current society that are doing it a bit better or has potential? Like I'm thinking of Montessori schools, which I don't really know of too much, but I've encountered some healthier minds that I've encountered have often said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I came from the Montessori school system," or different networks who are doing homeschooling in a way which both enhances the nobility of the student at the same time as giving them the means to pass the stupid standardized testing and like walk in that weird line. Is that something that you've struggled with or observed as being something which some people have done better or worse than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly don't think that, I really don't think there's a lot of approaches, and I've just from just from my limited exposure to the various approaches that are being taken. Obviously, you've got a lot of research done in education, which is, has its problems. But one of the things that's clear to me is that, there isn't really any movement that's doing that has developed and cultivated a method of education in terms of formal education, formal educational method. And I guess probably, at least my experience is that with a lot of the examples of better outcomes, kind of it tends to be driven by individuals, right? It tends to be driven by people who are in those positions, who are driven enthusiastically to try to get a good outcome or care enough about the students. And we've all heard those stories, right? Whether it's in, usually it's in the context of public education, but even in other settings, it's that people always usually remember one or two professors or teachers in their lives that have really motivated them. And it has more to do with the individual's enthusiasm. And that's usually, but as far as systems of approach outside of, certain political movements that have actually fought to revive classical education, outside of that and what you yourself have done, I don't see any formal policy or structure or develop methodology which really represents that. So I don't see it. But again, you might see the isolated success stories. You can't take as gospel, because even when there is success, it depends on the individuals. It's kind of like, it reminds me of the story of going out and like debriefing when you go out and do political organizing. One person can say the exact same thing, but not get the result because they're using words, and it's not filled with the intention and focus that, so it's not about the form, so to speak. It's really the success of people who are educating young people comes from, how serious are you? How passionate are you about thinking about what that individual needs? And that's actually one of the things that the Brethren of the Common Life were interested in. They would think about where they're evaluating where the individuals were in their development, right? It's not about, did they read this book and get no, what are the indications that this person really understands what they're dealing with and developing into the full set capacity of a human being. That, I think that intention has to be there in whoever is teaching. And again, I think that I'm convinced that the only way we're going to actually develop that proper system that you're asking about is through a politically motivated movement. Political in the sense of not teaching political doctrine per se, but the political motivation that implicit in Frederick Douglass's as a young boy, his recognition that developing the full totality of people, as Schiller discusses in his aesthetical letters, right? Instead of analyzing the implications of the French Revolution, Schiller says, okay, let's look at what's missing in the intellectual and emotional development of the people that missed the opportunity. And so I think that the political, the space of this political discourse on education policy or whatever, that vacuum needs to be met by this recognition.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot. And it's like, I remember myself when I was in high school, at a certain point, it was a discovery for me that I could half-assed it and cheat and still get by without knowledge, because I was demoralized, thinking, okay, well, every time I try to figure out why a formula is true, I can't get an answer, even when I ask the professors or the smarter students. So maybe that is knowledge, is just memorizing things that are not understandable. And so the only other option then is stop stressing about trying to get a good mark when you can cheat, not get caught, and still just build on faulty foundations, but nobody knows. And then I got my diploma in high school and continued on in life. No real negative implications per se. And like inversely, the oligarchy, they like hierarchy in a bad way too, where you see these initiatory rites and degrees of initiation, where if you memorize certain symbols, certain rituals, you're allowed to move up in the chain of command. But there's no knowledge. You could read Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, and he talks about the Pythagorean theorem and all of this sacred geometry, but there's nowhere in there any actual knowledge of what he's talking about. They're just imposing values onto geometries that they have never taken the time to understand how to build, how to construct a square or a pentagon, or what is this golden section that they adore. Whereas what you're talking about involves both curriculum, like there's definitely a guideline, but at the same time, an accommodation for the individual, because sometimes a student might go through the steps, but if they don't have knowledge, you don't want to just necessarily have them go on to the next thing. You want to really make sure that you don't, the foundation is always firmly built on discoveries every step of the way.
And this is why you have to be Socratic, because how do you know your student might be going down a path? They might be full of shit or just but them straying from your established path might be them making a new discovery. So you have to be Socratic in evaluating the not just determining that this person has strayed, but you have to then see what's the purpose, and that's what Socrates would do. And it made, as you were speaking, I was thinking about some biographical works on Einstein that talked about in his experience in university, where he pissed off one of his university mentors because he was in his classes, instead of doing exactly what the course required, Einstein had this not fixation, but he was completely focused on thinking about the implications of certain ideas about physics that it was just something he was passionate about kind of exploring. So he did this and thereby slightly neglecting some of the stuff he was expected to do. And instead of listening and thinking about what motivates this passionate kid doing this stuff, the person just got angry and punished Einstein for this. And it's so important as a teacher. What's your job? Your job is not, unfortunately, this is how teachers' assistants, grad assistants are treated today. They're basically errand boys and girls for their professors. And the focus is not the development and cultivation of these people. They're basically treated as adjuncts, or waiters and waitresses for the professor. So, but the question is, why can't we take a young Einstein, and if you see a fire of enthusiasm, yes, you have to evaluate, but you have to see what's there, right? Don't put out the fire. Maybe the fire is threatening to burn itself out, right? That's kind of this biblical thing of the seed that sprouts too quickly in the wrong direction. So a teacher has to be a guide, but then you have to also be smart enough to see this guy really might be motivated properly. And so we have to set ourselves up to be able to do that.
Right. And that's the whole humble part of the teacher. Like Socrates was always making the point that the only people qualified to be teachers are people who are also simultaneously students, meaning you got to be prepared that your so-called student might look at something in a way you never even conceived. And instead of crushing it because it's not something you recognize, you want to be able to have the humility to both admire and then encourage pursuing that line, right? And then learning from that as well. So, again, very good point. It comes back to Kuza's coincidentia, coincidence of opposites again. But dude, this was really good. This is a very, very stimulating presentation. I think you awakened the passion in a lot of people here. So if there are any, like I said, links that you would advise people to check out, send them to me and I'll include them in the description box. I couldn't find your email, unfortunately, so I
Okay.
can't share your email.
Okay. Yeah.
If you do that in the chat box, maybe that's something you can do before I close it out or after I stop hitting
Yeah.
record.
What
Yeah.
I'll do is, I'll do that. And well, one thing I will say just in closing is, I appreciate your enthusiasm because we are both, when this came up in the context of our discussing, some just kind of catching up on what each of us respectively was involved in. And when you heard mention about the brethren, just, obviously I could picture on the other end of the phone line, your eyes lighting up and you being really interested and curious about this, which is what you prompted you to challenge me to, hey, come and share this discussion. And so for me, that's an example for me of enthusiasm being infectious. So I appreciate you doing that. And I just want to encourage the stuff that you're doing and other people online here are involved in, because the reason that great people like Thomas More and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King develop and Joan of Arc develop courage. It's not to be martyrs. They're not looking to be martyrs, but they have a higher sense of identity, like Socrates. It's shaped by this deepening sense of aesthetical education, and I think that if we just keep doing that, I'm excited by what this kind of conversation portends. So thank you for doing this and continuing to do this. Thank you.
Hey, nope, my pleasure. And I'm just noticing here, I was about to close it up, and then I saw Magdalena, who's a teacher, put up her little digital hand. And so, Magdalena, you got in just in time as the door was closing.
I know. And I'm not sure if this is, well, okay, it's at the end now. So anyway,
okay.
Yes, I was a teacher, and just a thought occurred to me. As a teacher, you strive to create that enthusiasm in the kids, the breakthroughs, the discovery, the spark of discovery. And you really have to consciously set up things that the student can have a discovery breakthrough. And that's because that's when they get excited. They found out and they discovered something that they hadn't known before. And kind of, if you create these situations, and I was thinking about when you were talking, Alex, I thought, okay, not all the children always react the way you want them to react. Some get caught in one aspect and some get caught about something else. So you have to be flexible enough as a teacher to be able to go with the flow, so to speak, okay? Because you need to encourage them, okay? Oh, my battery is running low, so I'm going to cut off. But I just wanted to say that quickly because that's very, very important.
Yes, and I agree with you, because if you start from a simple linear pragmatic thing where I'm checking off boxes or I'm teaching because I need a paycheck, you might need that. But if the motivation is driven by an internal, like a spiritual fire, then you always have the battery, an endless battery, to fuel whatever you need to help other people make that discovery. Yeah.
Because remember how you felt when you discovered something, right? That's what it is. I mean, that's the thing, right? How do you create that recognition, that excitement, okay, all the time in kids? So then they want to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And that is what seems like it seems magical, but it is what makes us those moments that people see as that people remember from childhood, right?
Yeah.
It is something that has a transformational, revolutionary impact on as their being, the core of their being, and that's why creating a culture that does that is so nonlinear, right? If you have a culture around that, you can change everything.
So I want people to think about two things. I know most people here were present last week when Jerry gave his presentation on the Marlowe Shakespeare elevation of the culture, the edification of the culture, that involved both the political layers for the Battle of the Soul of England, and opposition to the Gnostic operation around John Dee, around Francis Bacon, who are doing the very opposite, at the same time and same place. So think about that now that we have a better sense of like what allowed for people like Shakespeare or earlier Thomas More and to emerge onto the scene as they did, and what they were feeling and thinking, what was awoken in their soul. Next week, there's a nice bridge. This presentation is such a good bridge. Because next week we're gonna have Hans Schantz, who's going to be going through a presentation on how it went wrong with Francis Bacon's New Atlantis and his invisible college approach to creating a system of education for slaves, basically designed specifically to give people the illusion of knowledge with none of the reality of it. So that'll be a fun presentation next Sunday, 2 p.m. for those who are listening. And I think the contrast of point counterpoint is just really, really good. So thank you, Alex, so much for doing this, and thank you everybody for joining us.
And I will try to tune in the future. But usually I work at this time. But there are times when I can tune in. I will definitely look at it after it's recorded if I can't be there live. But thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
All right. Cool. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Take care.